And my agenda for today is to go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves. And then I'll make a few comments just to, try to provoke you. And then we'll let the conversation go wherever it goes.
Let's start this over again. Rewind the tape. Department of Management, GW Business School.
Yeah, I'm a research professor at the Elliott School.
Jim Rosenau. I teach international affairs.
Now, what am I going to say? You are University Professor of International Affairs. I'm Peter Cause. I'm University Professor of Philosophy.
Mark Sterick from Strategic Management and Public Policy.
I'm Lowell Christie from the Cultural Strategies Institute and come from the Cybernetics School.
Joe Firestone, and I'm the Director of the Knowledge Management Consortium International. I can't see up.
Dennis Chaffee, I'm a professor in the Decision Sciences Department.
Paul Squeersman, Department of Management.
I'm Ethan McAfee. Don and myself teach a investment class at GW with real money.
And I'm Don Lindsay. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of George Washington University.
And I'm Arthur Wilson, Finance Department. I teach here. Mark Naterno, Fellow in Jack, WF Foundation.
Robert Savicos, the Department of Finance.
The field of cybernetics, which I think is very close in thinking to what George was expressing today. And in that effort, we were, in a sense, trying to make a scientific revolution to influence a number of fields. Now, those of you who are familiar with the philosophy of science, which I think is everybody in the room, knows the work of Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper. And Kuhn, of course, said you have periods of normal science, a period of revolutionary science, another period of normal science. And he said the way you move from a period of normal science to a period of revolutionary science is through incommensurable definitions. In physics, it might be that mass, length, and time are fixed versus that mass, length, and time are variables or functions. This morning, I showed you a table of equilibrium versus reflexivity theory. You could interpret those as a listing of incommensurable definitions, indicating a transition from a period of normal science to a period of revolutionary science. Whether you agree with it or not, it gives a little zip to the conversation. And there was a time when we were promoting what we call second-order cybernetics or biological cybernetics. And we did this for about 10 or 15 years, and I got bored with it. I thought we were doing the same thing over and over again. Let's move on from the period of making the transition and trying to get back to a period of normal science and just do science using the new understandings. Well, how do you make that transition from revolutionary science to normal science? Kuhn doesn't say much about that. But he and others do refer to something called the correspondence principle, which was first formulated by Niels Bohr when they were inventing the quantum theory. And it basically says that any new theory should reduce to the old theory to which it corresponds for those cases in which the old theory is known to hold. And you can picture it this way. If you have the old science or the old theory and all the cases explained by the old theory, then you add a new dimension, say relative velocity, or the diameters of molecules in the gas laws, where previously you assumed you had a point mass, but as you compressed it, you realized that the diameters had to be considered. So anytime you add a new dimension, then you get an expansion into a new scientific domain. And the great advantage of the correspondence principle is that what it says is that all the data that supported the old theory also supports the new theory. But you can explain an additional set of cases. And that's comforting to those people who have invested their lives in the old theory and now see a new theory coming along and upsetting their life's work. So, if you can formulate the new position by formulating a new dimension, then I think it makes the transition to the larger theory easier. so then I would ask you the question, what is the new dimension that reflexivity is adding to existing economic theory?
That's a very good question. I think it has to be the bias, the inherent bias that you have to bring to decisions. The fact that it's not simply information that leads to action, that something is in between, and that something in between adds a new dimension. So, for instance, if you take Joe Stiglitz, who has expanded the traditional economics by adding the concept of asymmetric information, has brought it closer to sort of my view of the situation, but he hasn't gone far enough, because he's still building everything on information as if information were translated into action by rationality. That it was a rational process. So I think that is what is new. And then you have behavioral economics, which fills in the other part of it, because it doesn't take this reliance on the assumption of some kind of rational process, but actually looks at how people behave, and then they turn out to have asymmetric values. That they value security more than reward. That they have a greater risk aversion than they have desire. I mean, this is one of the things that they've shown. So they've all come close to where I think I am, but they haven't quite made it. So I think it's this inherent bias in the decision making that is the new dimension.
Can I contribute an example to the asymmetry you spoke about? If you do a poll and you ask people, if someone sues you and they lose, should they pay the court cost? And more than 80% of the people will say yes. And then you turn the question around and say, if you sue someone else and you lose, should you pay the court cost? And only 40% of the people say yes. So I try to explain to my students, these are the people we're dealing with.
Right. Good point.
One of the concepts that came up briefly in Alchemy of Finance, which I thought was quite interesting, with regard to the concept of index funds. And index funds, of course, are supposed to, if you look at all the evidence that is used by supporters of index funds, they can take pretty much any universe of active managers and prove that there's no statistical evidence that active management can beat indexation. And I think they missed the point, because they're assuming that the process of active management is designed appropriately, and it's not, because the concept of active management is based on running a business, which is a complete dichotomy to the concept of running an investment management function. As a business, your desire is to grow your customer base and grow your revenues. That is in direct competition with successful investment results. And so as a consequence, I think we put too much faith in the investment management industry as being structured the right way, when in fact there's a tremendous amount of flaws in it.
Well, it's a slightly different subject, but I think that if you take an average, a statistical average, then you'll always, by definition, get average performance. So it's really the divergence between individual managers and